Well, if you haven't read Sarah Hepola's Blackout, Remembering the Things I Drank to Forget, you are in for a treat. We're going to talk with Sarah today. She's going to go deep into her story, sharing about the book, sharing about her experience with addiction and recovery. And we're going to get to know a little bit more about this amazing, amazing woman. Here we go with Sarah Hepola.
Here, we want to show you what's possible in the world of sobriety. We introduce you to the various tools, programs, and resources available, because there are way more options than you may even realize. We want you to find the one that works for you.
And we do it through people who share their pathway to recovery and will help you find your path to freedom. Because getting sober can feel hard enough. You don't have to do it alone. I'm Sarah Roberts.
And I'm Roger DeVoe, and this is Sobriety Starts Here.
All right, Sarah Hepola, I have been looking forward to this conversation since we set it up. I can't wait to dig into Blackout, Remembering the Things I Drank to Forget. Thank you so much for being with me, and thank you so much for writing this amazing book.
You're so welcome. I'm glad to be here.
So happy to have you. So let's talk about it. Let's dig into Blackout. I want to know, it's funny because in your dedication you wrote for anyone who needs it. And I was going to ask you, who did you, when you were sitting down to decide to write this book, who did you write it for?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I wrote it, I think it sort of started small and got larger. I think I wrote it for myself in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
When I quit drinking, I felt a tremendous cratering of hope and purpose. And I felt like I had lost my identity, and I had lost my social circle, and I had lost my crutches. And so the idea of a book kind of emerged to me as a new way to find my path. But then the more I worked on it, the more the people that I wanted to reach out to were the people that were in where I had once been. You know, the farther along I got in sobriety, the stronger I felt. Yeah. The more I felt a renewal of all these things I just told you I lost what felt so devastatingly. You know, I felt kind of renewed purpose. I was really starting to like my life. I was starting to feel comfort in my own skin. And I was thinking about who I was back then in the first months when I just had a total loss of faith and also felt so crushingly lonely. And I really turned to many things, you know, Haagen-Dazs and Netflix, but books, because books had been an early comfort for me. And so I was looking for companionship in books. And I think that what I wanted to do was to write a book that might be a companion for somebody in that lost place.
Yes, that makes so much sense. When I got sober, I remember a friend gifted me. It was funny because there are a few similarities in your story and mine, and I loved reading that. And so one of them was my friend got sober a couple of years before I got sober, and I was sort of floored. Like, I couldn't believe she got sober, and you share about that in your journey. But yeah, it was like she said to me, you know what? I want you to read this. And it was Drinking a Love Story by Carolyn Knapp. And that was really the only piece of work that was out there. But it was like, I finally felt like, oh my God, I'm not alone. I couldn't believe how I felt knowing that I was not the only one going through it. And that is exactly what your book does, because it goes so deep into the blackout. And not everyone's a blackout drinker. I was. And so to me, reading, from the first sentence of your book, you cannot put this thing down. So anyone watching that has not picked it up yet, you're welcome and sorry, but you're just going to have to spend the afternoon or a couple of days reading it. It's absolutely incredible for that. So yeah, I totally get that feeling of wanting to feel in someone else's words and story that we're not alone. And that's exactly what you've done.
Yes, thank you. And I like that you brought up Carolyn Knapp's Drinking a Love Story, because it was the most important book for me, both in my realizing that I had a problem with drinking and also probably wanting to write a book as well. I read that book when I was 23. I was 35 when I finally quit drinking. So there's a long lag time between my reading that book. But I remember I was walking through Barnes & Noble. I had a crushing hangover. I saw a book that was just called Drinking, a Love Story. And I was like, I'm in. Yeah. I don't know where that book's going, but it sounds like my story. And I sat outside and I read it, and it was like watching my heart reveal itself to me. You know, like I didn't know that other people drank like I did. I didn't know that they had the mental obsessions and the kind of private shames. I'm 23, so I'm still stuck in that, you know, kind of heroic, you know, mythologizing around alcohol, that it's, you know, that we're all having a blast and it's great and this is how we want to be, you know, and sometimes it was, but sometimes it was a lot darker than that. And so Carolyn Knapp's story was so important to me. And you know, I think probably one of the things that I thought about as I was working on this book was how could my book be different than hers? But one of the things that had happened was that book came out in 97, and a whole generation of women had been brought up in a kind of drinking as empowerment narrative. And we had come of age with these stories about women at happy hours and this sort of sisterhood of Chardonnay. And so that was something that really didn't exist in Carolyn Knapp's day, at least not so prominently. And so that was an opportunity for me. And I also wanted to write about blackout drinking, which nobody had really written about before, and was something I didn't even research until I started working on my book. And I couldn't believe that I had been plagued by this thing, this weird thing, which was an amnesia, like an alcohol-induced amnesia, and I never even knew what it was.
And I think that so many young people, we're talking a bit about young people, they just think that blacking out, like, that's just part of it. Like, what's your problem? That's what happens. We all laugh the next day about all the crazy things that we did and forgot about. And it's like, this is not normal. Like, this is not acceptable. And yet it is exactly what's going on in college dorms and beyond. I mean, these are things that are like, most of the time when I drank, I would at least brown out, if not blackout. So I'm wondering, because of all the research you did on brownouts and blackouts, can you kind of explain what both of those are?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for asking. You know, one thing is that college students often talk about, they use a phrase called let's get blackout, but it's actually a vague term for them. They mean it kind of like let's get smashed. And what they don't realize is that some of them are having actual blackouts and some of them are not having blackouts. So when they refer to blackout drinking, some of them are talking about holes in their memory, and some of them are just talking about a kind of intense abandon. So even within the use of the phrase, there's a real squishiness of what it means. Mm-hmm. But basically, and in the medical community, blackout drinking was very long misunderstood. It is too long of a story of why it is, but it wasn't until the 21st century that neuroscientists started to study binge drinking at colleges, and they realized that blackout drinking, which had once been thought of as this like late stage alcoholic thing, which is why you would find blackout drinking on all the diagnostics for are you an alcoholic? Okay, so they realized that blackout drinking actually was experienced in some way by 50% of the drinkers on campus. And that was there was a much higher number than they originally thought. So, and in fact, the guy that was doing the study, he went back and had to do it again to make sure this was actually accurate. Okay, but basically what this means is that 50% of drinkers have a capacity to lose time or for their memory to shut down while they're drinking. And what a blackout is, there's two kinds of blackouts. There are fragmentary blackouts, what you're referring to as brownouts, are just actually a different kind of smaller blackout.
And that's where you sort of lose bits and pieces, but you can kind of put it back together.
That's exactly right. I think of it like a light flickering on and off in your memory. So you have little pieces, but there's portions that are missing. And then the other kind of blackout is called en bloc, which is a French word, ENBLOC, and it refers to really large swaths of time that you lose, sometimes hours at a time, big chunks. And that's the kind of blackouts that I had. Not always. I also had the fragmentary, you know, I had this spectrum of blackouts.
And I think for so many people watching, we can all relate to that. And that's the fucking pain in the ass about being in addiction or an alcoholic or whatever way we want to label ourselves. But where we're like, sometimes we go to parties and we have a great time. And other times we go to parties and we end up as in the first scene of your book, which again, oh my gosh, I will not ruin it for anybody. It is so riveting that I read it to my boyfriend earlier today because I said, I'm talking to the author today. And he was like, oh yeah, he hasn't read it. And so I said, I want to read you the first one. And he was like, oh my God. He could not believe that story. And I said, honey, that was me. Like this is the kind of drinking that I did. But like you say, not every time. So it's like, that can catch us up, that can slip us up so much. And I remember early on in your book, you talk about going into like the nurse's office and you found the Am I an Alcoholic pamphlet, and you read it and you're kind of like looking for those ones that you can answer no to so that you can crumple it up and be like, okay, cool. Like I'm still good. And I think that is honestly the problem with what so many of us are doing, that some nights are okay. We don't have these issues. So we think, oh, well, that was just a bad night. Let's move on. And then it's like, how often do we allow that to happen before we finally succumb to it and realize that it is a problem in our lives?
Yeah, that's such a good point. I mean, I think oftentimes over the years, as I've been talking about my book, I noticed that people want a consistency to my drinking. They want to be like, so every time you drank, you blacked out. No. And if I had, I probably would have stopped drinking a lot earlier. Mm-hmm. A lot of the times when I was drinking, I had a kick-ass time. Yeah. I had the time of my life. Sometimes I forgot a little bit. Sometimes I got a ton. You know, there's a line in the opening where I say my evenings came with trap doors. And that's what it felt like to me. You know, it was like every 20th time somebody pulled that door, and then I went through it. Yeah. And then I woke up and was like, whoa, what happened?
And we try to kind of track back, right? We're like, okay, did I not eat enough? Did I not drink enough water? Like, did I not sleep enough? Was I on my period? Like, we're trying to give all of these reasons around why that happens. I think at least that was my experience.
Absolutely. And there's a reason we do that. It's because all of those factors actually do play into whether or not and how dramatically we black out, you know? And so I think one of the misunderstandings is like, oh, if somebody, here's something that people will say when I get interviewed, like, okay, so if somebody has a blackout, that means they're an alcoholic. No, anybody can black out the first time they drink. And in fact, it's really common to black out in a binge drinking environment. And the ways that you black out, the really major one is drinking on an empty stomach, because so blackouts come from a spike in your blood alcohol content. And what happens is that spike somehow disables the hippocampus, which is in charge of placing memories in long-term storage. So when you get that spike, that's what causes the blackout. So it's not necessarily how much you drink, it's how fast you get drunk. And it's drinking on an empty stomach, doing shots. There are influences like the hormones of your menstrual cycle. A big one these days you always have to mention is benzodiazepines. Anything like Xanax. I think Ambien is, Ambien. I mean, that's another mess altogether. But any pill that's like a benzodiazepine, that will create the roofie effect for somebody. But yeah, like it would always be this, I would wake up and then I would be like, whoa, how did that happen? And then you had to like run the scenes back through your mind and search it. You know, and then you had to do the clue search for like, what did I do last night? Where are the receipts? I think in one of the chapters, I call it CSI Hangover.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Cause you're doing like the forensic examination of like, oh, where did this pizza come from?
And then waiting for your friend to say those awful words that no one wants to hear. Do you know what you did last night?
Do you know what you did last night? Do you remember what you did last night? Do you remember what you said to me, Sarah? Or like the vague, you were a little weird last night. Or, you know, the compliment disguised as judgment, the like, well, you had fun. You know, like you were having a good time. Mm-hmm. And you know that underneath that, there's some, you know, simmering, just like, I never even knew what it was.
Judgment.
It's judgment. And it's also, but I also, like, I don't want to make it seem unfair. It's like, there's hurt. There's, you know, disapproval. Yeah. There's my drunkenness, my level of drunkenness made people uncomfortable, endangered myself and other people. It was not cool a lot of times. And so because I associated my drinking with the best parts of myself, it sort of, this is like the first act of the drinking story is always how awesome it is. And then the problem with blackout is that it literally disables you from being able to remember the last act of your drinking night. So you're always sort of remembering the first act, which is how kick-ass it was. And you were funny, and everybody was laughing, and you were dancing, and it was awesome, and everybody wanted to be you. And you forget the simpering fool at the end of the night that was crawling around like a kitty cat, or flashing strangers, or whatever weird thing I was doing. And, and then that's the part that then I had, somebody had to come and tell me about the next day. And it would just always, like, it was such a, like, just torpedo, just be like,
and I just feel like, I felt this way when I first got sober, and people around me would be drunk and they would say things to me, and I'm stone cold sober, and at the time resenting a little bit that I can't be drinking, and remembering that feeling now, looking back, when I would say, you have the luxury of getting to forget all of these nasty things and stupid things you're doing, nasty things you're saying and silly things you're doing. I have to remember this, like I don't get that luxury of being able to forget. And it did remind me to take, to go back into my drinking times, where that was really what was helpful about, I didn't do AA, but the 12-step framework of making those amends, of just even being able to put pen to paper to say, I'm sorry to people, that even if I couldn't reach them or find them, even to know who they really even were, but just even doing that exercise of truly being remorseful about the things that I said and did during times of absolute total blackout.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And drinking is interesting, because it is, the drinking on some level, on the level that I did, it is a sort of abdication of your human discomfort. Like, I always wanted to let go of my inhibitions and my shame and my embarrassment for myself, my insecurities, but you also let go of your judgment and responsibility and your social contract with other people. And there's all sorts of ways in which it is a kind of, I don't know, it's people that, when you drink as much as I did, you are always sort of, I don't know, like, well, I don't even know what I'm saying now. I'm sort of, I've lost my train of thought. Sorry,
That's
but it was
okay. That's okay. While you're collecting it, I was going to say that it reminded me of somewhere in your book where you talked about loving that feeling of losing control, because you were such a person who held up that control. I was the same, where I sort of I was perfectionistic because I needed to make sure everything looked good on the outside because everything was kind of a mess over here. And so drinking allowed me to just let it go. And it felt so freeing for a while.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think it's funny that I never wanted to take pills or do drugs, because that felt like I was out of control. Like, I wanted to be the agent of change, which is really funny. I mean, because you're not. And I think that's why I was using the word abdication before. It's like, I'm the agent of change by cracking a beer. But I understood, like, the path of drunkenness as opposed to, like, popping a pill and seeing what happened. Right. But anyway, I had such issues around control. I still don't like flying. I have a lot of perfectionism. I have a lot of those classic behaviors. And I do think that alcohol has presented itself to women specifically. And here comes my cat to join our conversation.
What's your cat's name?
So my cat's name, I did not name her. She is named Mitsu, which is a Japanese word for 3. She has only, you might see that she's hobbling here. She only has 3 legs. So she was named, hi honey. She was named by the vet techs that saved her. Because I think they get tired of coming up with names for 3-legged animals. So they have to get creative. And thus the Japanese word for 3.
Amazing. So Mitsu, kind of like, not METOO, but MITU? Is that what
MITTSU?
Oh my goodness. Mitsu. Oh, cute. Cute.
Yeah,
well, she can come on in whenever she likes.
And she doesn't want to feel left out. So anyway, I think that alcohol presented itself in the 21st century as this real miracle drug for women who were overextended in the way of trying to cover the bases of both the women we had been raised to be and the strong women we wanted to become. And so it really fills in the gaps between, okay, well, I'm this good girl, but I want to be this ferocious, brave woman. Or I don't want to be a slut, but I want to be desired. All the contradictions that come along with womanhood, I really felt like alcohol, at least temporarily, was a way to solve those irresolvable conflicts, and kind of smooth over between the part of me that was afraid to be judged but really wanted attention, or the part of me that was shy but wanted to be heard.
Yeah.
And a lot of my story was about just wanting to be a part of things, but being probably a more natural introvert and extremely self-conscious. And so alcohol really brought me into the center of the action. But I think that control thing and the perfectionism thing is so funny, because if you want to use a tool that will basically obliterate your perfectionism and make you sloppy, falling off bar stools, tripping in the middle of the street. I mean, it's really, I remember this, there's like a Saturday Night Live sketch where they show these girls getting ready for a night out, and they spend all this time like making their like mascara perfect and like getting into these like giant heels and this like tiny skirt, and they look amazing, and then they get wasted and they're like puking in the streets and all their makeup smeared. It's like how we end up doing this thing where like we embroider ourselves down to the square inch, and then we drink ourselves into this just puddle of grossness.
Totally. I remember when Caroline Knapp shared that, where she caught herself in a mirror after or in a store window, something like that, where she had spent all this time with the perfect outfit, the perfect hair, the blowout, the makeup, and then caught a glimpse of herself in the store window and was just appalled at what she saw. And, that wasn't necessarily the day she quit drinking, for sure, but it was I love that there are these whispers. And it's funny because there was a line in your book, I think it's early on, and you talk about, again, after that being with the, looking at the pamphlet, and you were saying, am I an alcoholic? Like how do I how do I know if I am or not? And how can I just not be? Like, we don't want, find any reason for it to not be what it really is. I think so many of us go through that angst where it's like, we just don't want it to be the thing that it is, because we don't want to be the thing that we feel like is going to be so outcast. We just don't want to be on the margins. And for someone like me, and you were sharing, that wasn't always maybe in the in crowd, I was more of probably an introvert. I was always trying to find my way in. And so alcohol for me was a way in, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that most of us, I hate to generalize, but I would think that at least a lot of us are turning to the bottle for a sense of belonging and inclusion that we might not have felt. And so when you find yourself in that place where you're starting to look at the word alcoholic, well, that's exclusion. That's immediate cast from the group. That is cast out of Eden right now. And so that was, I knew from my college years that I had what you would call like I knew I had a genetic predisposition to it based on the fact that I was Irish and Finnish, and alcoholism ran in my family. But I also knew that my behaviors were starting to track towards the red flag area. And so a lot of my story is about trying to stay in the center lane where I can keep alcohol. Yeah. I need to stay in that place where I drink just enough to be able to have fun and party and be wild and lose myself, but not so much that I have to lose alcohol. And I end up in those recovery meetings where we're talking about God, because that's not where I want to be. And I don't want, I tried to hold on to alcohol for more than a decade, of this time where I knew I didn't drink like other people, but if I just held my breath and wedged myself into the right heels and, metaphorically, you know, I could keep it. And I kept it for quite a long time, but, and I probably could have kept it longer, is the truth.
Totally. And I think a lot of people do.
Yeah.
Right. I think a lot of people, look at my rock bottom or your rock bottom and just say, well, why was that the end for you? And it just, for whatever reason it became. But I want to read on the top of page 11, where this is what I was wanting to share. I just love this line. I starred it and underlined it. I think I knew I was in trouble. The small, still voice inside me always knew. I didn't hide the drinking, but I hid how much it hurt. And that sort of brought me to tears the first time I read it, because you weren't just talking about the, falling down the stairs pain that comes from the physical pain of that, but the emotional pain that is caused from the drinking and the addiction. So I want to get into that a little bit, but why don't we, as we're kind of talking about your family and your Irish heritage, let's go back a little bit, as far back as you want to. Can you share with us a little bit about your upbringing and your story to lead us to where then you are, where you are now?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in Texas, and we were outsiders here. My family was transferred from Philadelphia when I was 4 years old, and my parents looked for the best school system, and they found it in this very rich community where we rented this small house. And, I'm so grateful that my parents made this sacrifice to get me into a good school, right? That's a story that paid dividends. But the part that they didn't anticipate and then they couldn't see coming, that also shaped me very powerfully, was the sense of being less than in this community that had so much more than a lot of places in the world. I think that from a young age, I had a sense of not belonging and a sense of estrangement. I know that got a lot more acute as I grew older, and the social I don't know, like the labels between you, like they've got the designer jeans that I can't afford, and they're carrying the purse that I don't have, and we have a dented station wagon, and they have a Mercedes Benz, and how come they go to the sleepaway camps and I go to YMCA? Okay, so all those things are starting to distinguish themselves, and they're small things, like I had a safe life, and I always want to be careful to say that I'm so grateful for what I was given. But I think what happened to me was a splinter of inferiority that dogged me for a lot of my youth and adulthood.
Can I ask you, did your parents feed into that at all? Did you sort of internalize anything that they were experiencing, or was this your own experience?
So my parents were going through a pretty tough time in their marriage during my elementary school years. And my mother had gone back to work, and she was, she went back to work to leave my father because she wanted to get out of that marriage. But she was becoming a therapist, and the more that she learned about therapy and kind of repeated patterns of behavior, the more she was like, maybe I should stay. So her work ended up saving her marriage, and I think put our family on a much more solid grounding than it had once been. But that, like any change, took many years. It was a slow process. It wasn't an instant switch. And during those years, she stayed away more from our family than I think she wishes she had. And I think it gave me a sense of loneliness. I had an older brother, 4.5 years older than me. I worshiped him. He was very bright, and I would have loved it if he wanted to play with me. He had other things to do aside from having fun with his 4.5-year younger sister. I was not interesting to him. I think I took that as a rejection. I know I took that as a rejection. My father is very quiet, and he's the Finnish side, and he's not, he's a very loyal man, but very socially awkward. So I had a loneliness in my household that started to bleed out to a loneliness that I felt in school. Because as school went on, at first I really liked school as a straight A kid and got along pretty well with kids. But then as middle school starts and those things, the social pressures to have this and that start to happen, I kind of shrink into myself. I think a lot of what I'm describing they're the reasons I became a drinker, but they're also the reasons I became a writer. So both of these things, which are you being cast as like on the outside, being an observer, needing a sense of companionship, they are things that pushed me into the page and pushed me to look for solitude in reading. And then eventually, as I grew older, they pushed me into the drink. And so my story with drinking is I really had this like natural pull to it that I don't really know how common this is, but I took my first sip of alcohol when I was 4 because like I don't know, my dad gave me a sip and they didn't think it was a big deal. I think they thought I would think it was gross, but I really liked it. And so I started stealing sips of beer from the fridge when my mom would leave her cans of beer in there. And my mom and dad are not heavy binge drinkers. My dad, as he got older, slid into what I would call a kind of armchair consumption, you know, like a bottle of wine in an evening. Like, how did that happen? But my mom she is what we would generously call a lightweight, you know, like 2 glasses and she's under the table, that kind of thing. Okay. So I think, by the way, that's one of the reasons why she was never suspicious of me. You know, all this sneaking around, me stealing from her beer, like I don't think that even occurred to her because she never would have done it. You know, the reason she was drinking that beer so slow is because she didn't really like it. So anyway, so I used to steal those sips of beer, and then
how old are you? I know 4 years old when your dad gave you some beer, but then how old are you stealing the sips of beer?
I think I'm like 7, 8, 9. It went on for a few years and the sips got bigger. And I remember how like I would start to, like I'd drink too much. And then I was like, oh, they're going to be able to tell that this is gone. So I'm going to need to drink another beer to bring that down the level. And now I've got this empty beer can. I got to go throw it away in the trash in the alley. So I start doing these like kind of like good girls, bad little secret things. And all of this is coinciding with an early puberty that I really didn't know how to handle. I was the youngest kid in my class, and I was the first kid to get boobs, and I was the first kid to get my period that I knew of. I mean, who knows, really? But I mean, that gave me this added sense of estrangement in my own body.
Yeah, and you kind of must have felt a little like othered with the other girls or with the other kids.
Totally. And I felt very conspicuous. I just remember this sense of like not wanting people to look at me, and I would hide in like big baggy sweaters. And you know, I was living in Texas. I remember wearing sweaters in the summertime. It's like 105 degrees here. Like, what is this girl doing? Wow. And my mom, again, is sort of like, I don't want to draw attention to her. Like, maybe if I just leave her alone, she'll come to her own peace about it. It's like really hard to know how to deal with a kid who feels that self-conscious about their body. So, so then, but I was hanging out with my cousin who was like 4 years older than me. She had graduated high school. I'm like in the summer between middle school and high school. And I started hanging out with her friends and they're drinking. And so I start drinking with them. And it was just this really immediate sense of inclusion, belonging, a sense of freedom in my own body I felt like I had been searching for all my life. I mean, I really think there is a lot in the alcoholic story or in the drinking story that experience is like finding God. You know, it has that sense of like, totally. This is the divine spirit that I have been searching for all my life.
Yeah.
And it, so, but I also knew, I guess I kind of skipped one part of the story because when I was 11 years old, I also got drunk with my cousin. I got really, really drunk with her that summer, only one time. And I had a blackout. And I thought that the party was really, really fun. But then I woke up and she was saying these weird things to me. And she was saying like, do you remember when you took your pants off and ran around? And I was like, what? I didn't do that. That's crazy. Because I was super self-conscious. So like, why would I ever do that in front of these cool kids from her work? You know, that would be like super embarrassing. And she was like, yeah, you did that. And then you sat down on the stairs and you cried that everybody loved me better than you. And I was like, oh no, that really does sound like me. Because I knew that's what I thought. And I had such a sort of poor me complex. So I was like, oh man. And then that's when she told me, like, you had a blackout. And that's when I first learned that you could drink so much that you would forget something, which, 11 years old, like, that's a really early time to learn that lesson. And it really, really freaked me out. I could not believe that I had drank to the point where I had not remembered what I did. And so all the years, it really wasn't until college again that I had another blackout. And all those years when I was social drinking, and social drinking for me really began that summer when I was 13 and went through high school. I never blacked out again because I wanted to, again, it's that trying to stay in the good part of the evening, trying to keep it so that the fun doesn't turn around and slap you in the face.
And how did you do that? How did you control it? Did you eat food? Did you drink water? Were you pacing yourself? Like, were you conscientious of that all the way up until when then you ended up in college?
Well, I think probably what helped me more than anything was a borderline eating disorder, that I was completely freaked out about calories. So it was like a typical late 80s girl that's like doing aerobics after school every day and counting her calories, and an apple's 100 and a muffin's 400, all this nonsense. So I would only let myself drink 3 Coors Lights and no more. It was just total discipline. And I think you see this in a lot of addict stories, is this weird toggling back between like steely discipline and total abandon, and this like failure to be able to find a moderate path between those two things.
Yep.
So I was very strict about my eating during those years, and it had the side effect of keeping my drinking in check. And
So
then then when I got to college, I think a few things happened. I mean, one of them was like, I got this message that like college girls don't count their calories. That's not cool. Like you Dallas girl with your like dangly earrings and your like makeup mirror before class, like you got to cut that out. I went to school in Austin, Texas, which is, at the time, especially in the 90s, was really a bohemian city. College as a general rule is fairly, bohemian. And so like I was getting this message from my peers that like, you need to loosen up, kid. And then of course, then alcohol just sort of rushes in because I have this sense of insecurity. I don't feel as smart as the other kids. I'm out of my element. I don't look the part, and alcohol kind of comes in to give me the confidence and the sense of belonging and the kind of intellectual conviction that I saw in my peers and I didn't have in myself. And then as college goes on, then it becomes, wow, alcohol becomes like the red carpet to the hookup, festival, like, all the insecurities I have in my body. And of course, the more I'm gaining weight and the more I'm not, like the less confident I'm feeling about myself. And so then alcohol becomes this way to forget that. And then you disinhibit yourself so that you can hit on somebody or maybe mess around with somebody you wouldn't normally or whatever. So it just, alcohol, it was in college that it starts to become the answer to every question, by which I mean, what do we do when we're bored? We drink. What do we do when we're sad? We drink. What do we do when we're happy? We drink. What do we, like everything becomes, alcohol is the answer.
Yeah. And then after you graduate, are you now writing once you graduate and you're working with peers, and are you still feeling that sense that you're not measuring up? And is that still an issue for you?
I think that every time I would make a transition in my life, I would feel that renewed sense of, oh my gosh, I don't belong here. I don't fit in. It was almost like a reflex, the story that I was stuck in. So I really, by the time I graduated college, I felt so comfortable there. And I remember but alcohol had worn some pretty deep grooves in our behavior. And I remember thinking, when I leave college, I really want to cut back on the drinking because it doesn't feel right. My body was starting to feel sick. You're not just the hangovers, but just this like bloated sense of like, I'm out of balance. And then I got a job at this paper, which is a really cool local newspaper called the Austin Chronicle, where I was surrounded by people that were like encyclopedic about film and television and music and everything I had always cared about. I mean, I really can't imagine a better job for a, pop culture obsessed binge drinking 23-year-old. But what it did was it completely renewed this sense of, I don't know anything. I'm a fraud. I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm going to screw this up. They're going to kick me out. I'm going to lose my job. So the way that I know to manage this stress is drinking. And the way that I know to kind of adopt the posture of cool that I see amongst my colleagues is alcohol. And then you have the added wrinkle for me of I'm now working on big stories, and I am starting to get this sense of like, I can't write. Like, writer's block is an interesting thing. I think what happens is that your super ego starts messing with your ego. Like the critical part of you that really should only be brought in at the editing process starts talking to the free spirit that should really be in the creation process. Yeah. And you just cross these streams and you can't get anything done. And I had this big story due. It was going to be a cover story. It was due the next day. And I was stuck, and I started drinking wine, and it was like I could just release myself. And it was, there's this old mythology around alcohol and creative output, and I think most people, like, I'm not sure there's been an actual longitudinal study on this, but I think most people would agree that drunk people don't do great work. But I'll tell you what alcohol does, especially in the early phases of its work on the body, is to loosen those parts of you that are made up tight in the world. And so you start to feel freer, and you start to feel, and you feel confident. And I started to like, I'm good. This is really good. Like I'm getting that voice, and that voice allows me to get the words on the page so that I can wake up at 4 a.m. and edit this thing and get it done.
And that's why I think it's so terrifying for creatives, especially when they give up alcohol, because it's like, without it, am I going to be able to have that? Am I ever going to be able to get another great idea again? Or what do I do when I get into that writer's block mode, when I used to use alcohol to get me out of it?
That's exactly right. And I think one of the epiphanies that I had, and it took many years, was that alcohol never gave me anything I didn't have already. I just needed to find new paths to access it.
Beautiful.
It's the same thing. I mean, confidence, comfort in my skin, connection with other people, sexual pleasure, and creative inspiration. I'm not going to lose those. I just have to find new ways to get to them.
So tell us, how do you do it?
And the problem with this is that it's going to be much harder than just drinking. And I think that's I sometimes feel like alcohol was this way that I could be like, oh, this is what all this stuff is supposed to feel like, but now you have to give up the alcohol and go find it on your own. So it was like, it gave me the mouthfeel of it, and then now I got to go create it. So how do you do it? Slowly and painfully. And there's no other way. And I think what happened for me, so I quit drinking at 35 years old, and it always sounds so clean and neat when I say it that way. I just quit drinking at 35, just one day, just woke up, quit drinking. It was so easy. No.
I mean, if we go back to what I just read about when you said, I had known it all along. I knew that this was an issue. And that was when you were 23 years old.
People are like, when did you decide to quit drinking? And I'm like when I was in college, and then I spent 15 years trying to figure out how I could avoid it. Yeah. And I would wake up and I would say, I'm quitting today. And then I would change my mind at 3. And then I would go into the recovery programs, and I would fall out, and I would, I did everything. So, but anyway, I quit at 35. That's when I finally did find a sobriety that stuck. And it was a very slow walk out of that place.
Yeah.
And I had to give up my old ideas about what my life was going to look like. And that was really heartbreaking. It really felt like losing, the future you hope to have with your husband or something. Not that I've ever had one, but I've wanted some of those too. And those were a heartbreak. And this was a heartbreak. It was like, I'm never, it's always interesting to me. Everybody that quits drinking, they have like one thing that they always imagine they were going to do. And for a lot of us, it's like, but I can't drink at my wedding. And it's like, well, first of all, I wasn't dating anybody, why that? Why the drink at my wedding? On the happiest day of my life, I need some kind of chemical additive. It's a very strange social custom that a lot of us are just really, I think, emotionally tied to. And I just had to give up a lot of that stuff. Or what I did at the time, I never gave it up in the moment. I was just like, don't worry about it now. Don't worry about it now. You don't even have a boyfriend. Just get through the week. And so what happens is, I think you slowly start to get yourself back. And it's funny because like alcohol feels like, oh, this is the real me. But then over the next 25 years, it's a process of losing yourself.
Or when people call it truth serum, I'm like, ugh, it is definitely the opposite of that.
You lose yourself. And so then you're in this place of like, who am I and what? But it starts to come back. And for me, it started to come back very slowly. I remember, I think probably the first things that happened for me were just the joy of waking up without a hangover.
Yeah.
That was a peace and a serenity that I think I had been chasing in alcohol, weirdly enough.
And that never gets old, does it?
It never gets old. It literally never gets old. I've become a morning person in a way that kind of freaks me out and disappoints some old part of myself. But I love it. And every morning when I wake up at 5:30 and I'm like, this day is gonna be amazing. It's so great. I love mornings so much. And it's so opposite town from all those years when it's like you wake up and the first thing you think is like, what have I done? How am I gonna make it through? How am I gonna get through this day? What is it? Like all of that and the like, I'm an overthinker. So the last thing I need is like just more incentive to obsess. Yeah. And that's what my drinking was for so long. So that was probably the first thing that happened. And then I think I started to notice that around some friends, I didn't feel comfortable at all. And around other friends, I felt super comfortable.
Like when you first got sober?
Yeah. And that was like this really interesting litmus test for me as to whether or not I'd been pretending around them. Because the ones that I felt comfortable with, I knew they knew the me, they knew me. And the ones that I was like, oh, I can't be around this person. It makes me so uncomfortable. I want to drink. Those people I had been hiding with. And so I just stuck to the people that I didn't have to hide with for a while. And I hid in books and movies, the same things I did when I was in sixth grade and seventh grade and feeling really lonely. And then, and then slowly a sense of who I was and my, actual confidence started to return to me. And then over the years, but I definitely did that classic downshift. I went straight from alcohol to sugar. Oh, just direct.
Me too.
Direct.
You did Haagen-Dazs, I did Ben and Jerry's, but yeah.
I used to pick up a 6-pack on the way home from work, and then I started picking up a pint of Haagen-Dazs peanut butter and chocolate. And I would eat it at the same time, and I would do the same thing, which is that I would throw away the top as though this container is not actually like resealable. Like, no, I have no need for a cork in the same way that I have no need for the top of these things are trash now.
Or the bowl. I had no need for a bowl.
Oh, by the way, no need for a bowl. No, there were no receptacles around here. Just like, I need a spoon and I'm going to eat right out. And then, and it's like dripping on me. I mean, whatever. Like, that was what I had to do for a while, and I would do it again, because I think you have to go through that to then get to the point where you go, oh wow, I actually don't like this in myself. This doesn't feel good either. So now I've got to get rid of the sugar and fat addiction.
It does it really does shine a light on the truth that the addiction, it doesn't matter what it looks like, if it's sex or porn or shopping or drugs or alcohol or sugar, it's about what's underneath it that we need to get to. And I think that we often, people on the outside of addiction that point fingers at people and just say, oh, if they would just quit drinking. I mean, what's their problem? As they're eating cookies, shopping, fucking, watching porn.
Absolutely.
It's like, right?
Absolutely. I think and by the way, I think I thought that if I just quit drinking, I would be fine. It was really and truly a disappointment that I was going to have to, it was not one demon to slay. There were many demons. And I did not like discovering that, because a year into my sobriety, when I sat around with a Jack in the Box splurge sitting around me on the floor with my ultimate cheeseburger and the curly fries and everything, and I was like, I'm going to have to do this thing all over again.
Yeah.
I was so mad because I was a year into this.
Yes.
And I felt like I should be better by now. So early sobriety for me, there was a lot of impatience, and there was a lot of, I should be X by now. I should have a boyfriend by now. I should be hot by now. I should be getting other sources of validation that I had lost when I quit drinking. So I am so grateful to myself that I didn't quit, because I think what happens to a lot of people is they start to notice how slow the change is going to be. They start to realize how high the climb, and they're like, you know what? I'm just going to head back, because there's something that calls to you about, even though drinking is a kind of brokenness, it's like that old, it's the brokenness I know. And that was for many years. And that's why I stayed in relapse for a long time. Last 2 years of my trying to quit drinking, 33 to 35, are just basically constant relapse for me. And I would be called back to that fold with this idea of well, okay, that doesn't work, but this other thing seems too hard. I'm going to go back to the old way and try to make it work.
Can I ask you, do you believe that relapse, Augustine Burroughs talks about relapse as being part of the addiction, not part of recovery. How do you feel about that?
That's interesting. I don't know. I mean, I certainly see what he's saying. I think I see my relapse as a kind of preparation.
Yes.
I think it was me trying on the new life before, and it's like some of us can't change in an instant. That's a very big switch. I'm a drinker and I drink all the time to never again. And so for me, I see it as a transition. And I look at it as my preparation to become a different kind of person.
Yeah, it's almost like the bridge between the two worlds. Yeah. And you get to choose. I relapsed 4 days later, just like you, and then 4 years later. And I really saw it as that bridge. It was like I stood at that precipice, and it was like you can either go back to where you know exactly what happens if you keep going down that road, or you can keep going down this new road that it's new and scary and you don't know what's on the other side of it, but at least it's not hangovers every day and making a fool of yourself and blacking out again.
Yep, that's exactly it. Yeah, I think I did see it as a bridge as well. I think I needed it.
Me too. Yeah, I'm so grateful for my relapse. I really thought 4 years. I thought I licked it. I thought I was good to go. I thought everything was figured out. This was the way I was going to be. This was good. I felt pretty good. And yet I was still hiding so much underneath. I still wasn't out publicly about my addiction. So yes, I really see it that way. I can see relapse as being very valuable. And this isn't to share with people that, that it's necessary or that it's a goal, it's not about that. I mean, certainly the goal is, quit drinking and let it be behind you and work on all the other things. But if it does happen because it's part of your journey, it doesn't mean that you then have to be taken all the way back. And I don't like that part of AA where it's all about time, because I do think a lot of people then feel like, how can they ever go back to AA if they've been 4 years clean and sober and then they do have a relapse? They don't want to admit it, so they don't want to go back, or then they just keep drinking because they say, well, I fucked this up, I may as well just keep going a while longer while I can.
Right. I mean, I think, one thing for me about the relapse is that I had to really try everything else besides quitting drinking. I really needed to, like, I had to cross off all the other things. The way I'm built is I needed to get myself to where I no longer had any doubt that this was the right way. And that just took longer for me. Mm-hmm. I've watched people come in and then just been like, oh, this is better. This is working for me. And I wish I could have done that. But I had to, like, when I would have those doubts, which I assume you did after 4 years or 4 days, where you were like, maybe I'm not enough. I think, because I was always coming up with like, I've got it. I know what I need to do. I've got a great plan. I was like full of great plans. So like, I needed to live out some of those plans. And I'm this way in other parts of my life too. I mean, I'll keep trying to make a relationship work, and I'll keep trying to make a job work. And I'll, I think I present as a cynic, but I think I'm secretly like an endless optimist. And I had to get that out of me for a while. Mm-hmm. And what happened for me is that because of those relapses, when I finally stuck around, it was like, okay, I've tried it. I've tried all that stuff.
Like I surrender.
Yeah. It was what I needed to do to get to that place of surrender.
Yeah.
And also, so that phrase that they use in recovery in AA, which is like quit the debate society. Mm-hmm. Because I was spending way too much time in my head going, well, what is alcoholism? And is it a disease or is it something else? And what are the, what is the scientific and behavioral and neuroscience, blah, 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 blah.
What's the genetic component to it? Who can I point my finger at?
Yeah, I mean, you can really get in the spin cycle of that and spend a lot of time there. And I think that I did myself a solid when I gave that part of it up and just said, let go of that question. Like what exactly constitutes alcoholism? Let's just let that go for a minute. Mm-hmm. And just see what your life would be like if you cut it out.
I hear that question so often, and I often will just suggest to people, the easiest definition is just if it's messing with your life, with your happiness, if it's something that keeps coming up over and over again as a negative in your life, just look at it. Just take a look at it and maybe give it a chance to take a little time away from it and then see what happens. And I do agree with you. I think so many of us are looking for that exact definition or what it actually exactly entails so that I can, cut myself out of that and say, nope, then I guess that's not me. So I can continue on with doing it.
Right. I mean, there's a failure of logic going on though, because anybody that is asking the question, am I alcoholic? They're having problems with alcohol. And there's this fantasy that people are divided into two camps. One in which they're alcoholics and they have a problem. And one in which they're non-alcoholics and everything's great. Go ahead, party balls, kids. And it's like, that's not how it works. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of people, like alcoholism, like anything exists on a spectrum. Drinking problems exist on a spectrum, substance use disorder or whatever you want to call it. And like this idea that if you could pin down the definition of alcoholism, I think it's an intellectual procrastination measure to keep yourself from having to really address the problem, which is that whatever you call it, you probably have a problem with drinking.
And is that the fundamental problem, a lack of connection with yourself, with others, with the work, with the world? Like, what is that to you?
I think that my problem with alcohol, I think of it like a genetic predisposition. So I just am able to drink more, and I respond to alcohol differently. Laid atop a set of behavioral habits that come from a psychological issues around insecurity and doubt and lack of sort of belief in myself, or whatever they come from, laid over time, so it's kind of like genetic predisposition plus behavior over time. And that results in this, whatever you want to call it, dependence. It's people focus a lot on physical dependence, like, did you get withdrawals? Well, I mean, I actually did have a racing heart and some things that go along with that, but lots of people don't. And I think that that's not, as a general rule, I don't think physical withdrawal should be the blueprint for whether or not you have a drinking problem, because physical withdrawal is more the kind of thing you would see in the I don't know, 30s and things, when people were drinking moonshine and stuff like that. They were drinking really much more intense liquors. So anyway, but emotional withdrawal, I mean, out of like crazy.
Yeah.
And that, it's tough, because sometimes I look at the diagnostic for alcoholism and I'm like, this is just describing college students. But that's another problem, is that actually we have a culture where a lot of college kids are basically given a blueprint for alcoholism. And it's shown to them as a path to sort of social acceptance. And you hear a lot of stories about kids that show up to college not really able to drink, and then they kind of make themselves and force themselves and learn to drink and learn to do. And it's like, what are we doing? What are we doing?
Like Annie Grace talks about in her book, This Naked Mind, that alcohol is the only drug we have to feel, we have to justify not taking. It's pushed upon us so heavily that if we're not engaged in that, think about the college students. I mean, especially when we were back in college, like, what an outcast you'd be if you weren't doing it.
I know. I still, I go speak on college campuses sometimes, and I talk to the sober groups, and it's always like 6 really sweet people. And I'm like, you guys are like my heroes, because I never could have done this.
Interesting, because they talk about the statistics changing, that there are fewer and fewer college, the statistics are looking like it's lowering in college students. And that's really sad to know that you're only getting a group of 6 sober kids amidst entire dorm.
Yeah, but you're right about the overall trajectory. I mean, I do think drinking is going down amongst a lower population, a younger population. I think they're going to have different demons to slay, because they have this technological piece and this pharmaceutical piece that was not as much our story.
Yes.
And so we're seeing drinking going away. I think that's a good thing. I also think that but I still think if you're somebody that's living a quote sober life, you're going to be an outlier in a college drinking environment. Even if we've come down from the really extreme, the peak of binge drinking is like 2005 to 2012 or something like that. I don't have the statistics in front of me, but there's this like peak of drinking, and then it starts to go down. And I'm glad to see that, but I do think that it'll be a very long time, if ever, that we won't see drinking as sort of like a normal, like it's just a normalized thing in culture. I mean, like the assumption is that you drink.
The assumption is that you drink. And again, you got to justify not taking it. And I think that it's such a badass thing to do to get sober, because even me at 46 years old, I still am the exception to the rule at every party I go to, right? Like, so often I go to parties and, what are you drinking? And they have nothing to offer me except for a plastic cup with water. And it's outrageous to me that in 2019, we are still made to feel marginalized because we don't take this drug, and it's still not promoted as a drug. We don't talk about it in that same way. And I do think that, attitudes are shifting, but like you've been talking about, things happen slowly over time.
Yeah, I'm starting to see culture shift on the sobriety thing. I mean, even though we are outliers, I'm watching sobriety move a little bit more into the center of culture, just a tiny bit. I feel like we're living in the golden age of flavored water. Between I can open my refrigerator behind me and show you like the panoply of seltzers that I have. And most people that throw parties these days can, toss a few LaCroix on the pile without putting themselves out. You're starting to see, I'm going to a really nice restaurant in a couple weeks. It's like one of the top 10 restaurants, and they have a sober drink menu.
Beautiful.
Which is amazing. Because that is first of all, that is just commercial like gold. Basically, you can make money from people and not even use alcohol.
I know.
I mean, suckers like me this is what the juicing trend should have taught everybody, that people will pay tons of money for even non-alcoholic drinks. And they're starting to realize that. And so you're starting to see the sort of foodie community embrace this, and all that stuff is really cool, because I think what we want ultimately, I don't think it matters whether or not somebody is drinking or not drinking at dinner. What you want is for people to feel included and like they belong, and you shouldn't feel like, well, you get the luxury experience, you, ma'am, get the bargain basement red Solo cup with water. So I hope you enjoy that, so
yeah, I agree. I think attitudes really are starting to shift, and I do think it's going to take some time, but it is encouraging. We're seeing Sans Bar and these other, which I love. So we chatted before we started recording. You and I were talking, and you were saying that you were worried a little bit at the end of your drinking. If when you quit drinking, would I be able to keep being a writer? Would I be able to do this? So I want to know what happened with that, and how long after you quit drinking did you decide to go ahead and write Blackout?
So I think about 6 months. It took about 6 months for me to start writing again. And during those 6 months, I was working as an editor at an online magazine, and I was helping other people tell their stories. And I really had this sense of like, okay, well, that's going to be my path now, is I'm going to help other people. And about 6 months in, I wrote a personal essay about drinking. And it was just like this return of myself. Like it was this, oh, like that's my voice. That's me. It wasn't like, oh, that's the drunk me, and now I'm the sober me. It was like, oh, that's me, the me I was all along. I could see it. I could have access to it. It came fairly easily. I got a lot of really great feedback to that piece, and it made me start to realize if there was something more that I could do. And what I had wanted to do from the time that I was at least 13 years old, if not earlier, was I always wanted to write a book. And I was the one that at the bar that was always telling you about the book she was going to write one day. And then I was never writing it because I was always hungover and watching reality TV. So I had all this time. I mean, I think that's another like conundrum of your sober life, is like drinking was like a full-time job for me. And like now I've got like 40 hours in my week. What am I going to do?
I know.
So having this idea of a book to work on was something that gave me this renewed purpose. And I was living in New York at the time, and I wanted to leave, and I moved back to Texas. And I thought to myself, like, okay, I'm going to get a draft written in about 4 months, which again is just hilarious. I mean, I just had this like really grandiose sense of like how quickly everything was going to happen for me. And then it took about 3.5 more years before I finished the book. And it sold and it came out. And, I think, honestly, I'm amazed that I kept writing as a drinker as long as I did. I mean, I now see what a drain that was on my creative energy, because the best time for me to write is in the morning. I wake up and I am at my maximum capacity, and I always try to write. I really, it's just my rituals. I wake up, I get coffee, I feed the cat, and then I go back and I write. I go back to my laptop and I write. And I do it before I can get all those ideas in my head about, like, you know, I'm always trying to kind of outrun the voices in my head that are critical, but I truly find it, most days I find it to be a joy. I think that I'm extremely lucky to be able to have that true channel to my own voice. Some of the things that I'm writing are professional. They're stories that I write for money, or a book that I'm working on now. Some of them are just journals. I mean, you know, I was lucky enough that at some age I found this connection with the written word, with the page, or whatever you want to say, because it's not exactly a page, but, you know, that allows me to have a connection with myself. You know, earlier you asked me, what is alcoholism, or what is a drinking problem? Is it a lack of connection with yourself? You know, that's an interesting idea. I don't think I'd ever really thought of it that way. I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that what has been so important for me in sobriety is continually building that connection with that still small voice inside of myself, and also that sense of being at home in my body. I mean, somebody that was feeling estranged from it for most of her life, and covering that up with a lot of, you know, hot clothes or tough clothes. I mean, I went through many fashion eras, you know, but alcohol was the greatest mask. Yeah. And so, you know, being able to come back to that, I feel like I can do it through my work, and that's just a great gift. That said, writing is always hard, and it's you know, it's never like I feel like if I were struggling on a project, as I normally am, and was listening to this woman talk about the beauty of waking up in the morning and the
birds chirping and the
birds chirping, I'd be like, fuck off, lady. But both are true. You know, it's a great struggle, but it's a tremendous gift.
True.
So, yeah.
In the book, you wrote a little bit about crocheting and rug hooking and finding things to do. And I've interviewed lots of people that are in recovery that say doing something with their hands was so useful. Knitting, you know, cooking, writing. Tell me more about the tools that you use in your recovery.
Yeah, that I did go through a really intense early crafting period. I forget what you rug hooked. It was something that made me laugh. I remember that where I was like, oh my, it was like a movie scene or something that you. No, it's a tabby. There's a rug hook of a tabby, but I also have a needle point of the Breakfast Club.
Yes.
So
that's it.
Yeah, there was a lot of time to kill. Club, yeah.
That's hilarious.
Yeah, very proud, very proud. Sincerely yours, the Breakfast Club. Yeah, that's sort of behind me now, although I would, you know, I'm happy to go back anytime. You know, one of the great things I found, I loved playing guitar. I learned to play guitar, and that was this way to unwind at the end of a day that was sort of a private pleasure, meaning that I don't go and like perform in coffee shops. But what I do is that I sit in my room and I play some songs and I sing. I was always trying to find ways to come down from the day, you know, because I do think that's one of the things that I had the hardest time with, you know, is like, how do you just unwind? And Netflix and food present themselves as like the first way, but it's like, okay, so what else could you find? You know, bike riding is always a nice pleasure. I take long walks, and I live in a really kind of lovely neighborhood, and a lot of trees around here. So I'll do that. I started taking dance classes not long ago. That was a big deal for me in terms of like trying to find that connection with my own body again. You know, because I was one of those people that like, if you got me drunk, I was like, a maniac. I was just like, you know, like I can't, I'm born to dance. But then if I was too sober, I was like, oh, no, I don't do that. Mm-hmm. So that's not cool. I don't want to do that. So I had to find a path back to that part of me that loved movement and found such joy and freedom in dancing. And so I started taking dance lessons, learning to dance with somebody else, which was really difficult. I never had done that ever. And it just, those kind of things have been gifts for me. They're challenges, and I don't always do them as much as I wish I could, because I think probably like most people, I get stuck in a rut of what's, like whatever, like my day tends to kind of take on the same ritual, but those are little things that I've come to really love more than anything. This is just going to sound corny, but I just really love time with my friends. And I think that's what I was drinking for too. Mm-hmm. I was just drinking to be around people and talk with them and hear about their lives and feel connected to them. And I wanted to tell my story, but I wanted to hear your story too. And I love the sort of free flow of ideas and thoughts that would happen around a table. And so those are like the happiest times for me, is just when I can do that. And it's been a great gift to know. I mean, I think I knew that didn't require alcohol because I'd done that when I was younger, but then you forget. Yeah. You forget, and you become so habituated to the pour of the glass and the Chardonnay in your hand, or whatever I didn't actually even drink Chardonnay, but whatever your drink is, you become so used to that it starts to feel like you can never have it again, but you can. Mm-hmm. Again, it's just finding a way back to that connection with yourself, but also with others.
I'm listening so intently, because it's like, you're just speaking the language that I think we all understand. It's this abandonment that we have, done with ourselves, where we forget who we are. We don't have a trusting relationship with ourselves. So we have to rebuild that in all of these ways. And so I love that. Do you still do AA?
Yeah, I do. I've been in the program for like 8.5 years now. So I've been sober 8.5 years, and I still go to meetings. And that's amazing to me, because I really, really struggled with that program in the beginning. And it's been a really nice way for me to continue to have a social structure, because first of all, as a writer, that's a very lonely profession. And then I live alone, and I work from home. So it's just sort of like, I don't have a social network. So it's really lovely for that. And I think it's also just been good. It's been a good way for me to ground myself. I mean, sometimes I get frustrated with the program. I think everybody does. And I definitely, something I heard in something you said earlier was this sense that like, it doesn't work for everybody. And I know that, I've definitely known people that don't use the program, or people that do for a while and leave. I think one of the beautiful things about the program is that it's there if you want it.
Yes.
It's always there for you. But the idea that it's the only way, that's just not true. And I don't think that the people that founded that program would have ever thought that it was the only way. I mean, they thought of it as the last resort for everybody that had tried all the other things that might have worked. I mean, Look, there's no wrong way to get sober. Those are words in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And, but for me, that program has provided, I think maybe I would call it like a moral framework as I tried to understand a new world. Something that kind of reminded me to stay less focused on myself, more focused on others, try to do good in the world, try to be of use. This pivot in me, I had such a craving for like adulation and fame and greatness and perfectionism and all this stuff. And I think it was part of what drove me to do good things, maybe like writing a book that might help people. But it also was driving some bad behaviors, like beating myself up, or feeling like nothing was ever good enough, or that like that wasn't enough and I need to do more, and like this sort of craven thing in me. And so I think that program has helped me pivot some of the behavior away from that insatiable self-seeking, and towards something that is a little bit more about humbleness and gratitude. And, you know, because for me, I've gotta pivot away from what I didn't get, and I've got to start focusing on what I did.
Oh, I love that. It's interesting because a lot of people will say, you know, what is the 12 steps? And I just recommend anyone in the whole world would benefit from looking at those 12 steps as a framework for just living a more authentic, good life.
Yeah,
I
I
not they
once
go
heard
to meetings or not, but
yeah, absolutely. I once heard the 12 steps as a path to looking the world in the eye again. And I really related to that as somebody that came into that program so ashamed for who I was and what I had done and the lies that I had told and the messes that I had made and the friendships I had paralyzed, you know, like I felt so bad. And so it really was a way to stand up on my own. And yeah, I agree with you. I think the 12 steps can be useful to anybody, whether or not you have a drinking problem or not, because they're a sort of, yeah, they're like step work. They're just, it's a moral guidance, right? It's basically how to live be more honest with yourself and others is probably the fastest way to say it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's what I liked so much about Russell Brand's recovery is that he just basically says, I mean, come on. Again, we talked about if you've got an issue with sugar, with porn, with sex, with drugs, with alcohol, it's all the same stuff. So can we not look at this? And if we could raise the collective consciousness by using these resources to look inward more than we do, I think it would just truly be such a different world we'd be living in.
I know. I love what Russell Brand's doing, and I love listening to him. And he just sounds a little bit like touched by the spirit, like in a really interesting way. Like he's just like that guy's got something going on in him, and it's like he's got a light and he's gonna let it shine.
That's such a good way of saying it. I agree. I mean, I got his audiobook just because I love his voice so much. So I thought it would just be a fun book to listen to.
Totally.
I have a couple more questions for you. I'm wondering, what is the best thing about being sober?
It's funny because the first thing that comes to mind is like the lack of stuff, you know. It's like not having to apologize, not being hungover, not being ashamed for what I did the night before. But I think that it might be having a truer sense of who I am and what I can do. And, you know, I really feel like sobriety was not just about cutting out drinking. It was not just about managing the damage. It was about reaching for the person that I always wanted to be. And I don't mean to make it sound like, so I've completed it, mission accomplished, I'm awesome. Because I really feel frustrated sometimes I'm still that person that's like, why didn't you write this book in 4 months? And, you know, that's still me. But I have felt such a more solid grounding in myself. Feels like things can't knock me off course as much as they used to. Mm-hmm. I really used to get upended by stuff.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Beautiful. I love that. And I borrow this last one from Oprah. Sarah Hepola, what do you know for sure?
Oh my gosh. What do I know for sure? I know that Oprah is great. I do. I love her.
Me too.
I know that when I tell the truth about myself, I feel better about myself and I feel closer to other people. And I feel more of whatever the Spirit of God is, because I don't know what it is. I think my spiritual path has been a little mysterious for me. But when I'm able to talk about my life honestly and people listen, it feels like a spiritual connection that is something like what I've been searching for all my life. So, and you know, that's why I write, but it's why I'm sure people listen to your podcast. And I think it's why people want to hear other people's stories when they quit drinking, you know, is just, we want to see the self reflected in the other. And so that's
Absolutely beautiful. You brought me to tears. I am such a big fan. I am so grateful for you to take this time to spend with me. Thank you for this work. It is absolutely incredible. Your prose is so beautiful. The way that you write is just, I mean, it just pulls you along page after page. You will not be able to put this down. I encourage you to find it wherever books are sold. Blackout, Remembering the Things I Drank to Forget by Sarah Hepola. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I just have loved every minute of it. Thank you.
Me too. Thank you, Sarah.
To get access to all of the free videos and interviews, visit sobrietystartshere.com.